The F-8 was the last of the gunfighters. Now, nothing could beat the F-8. And I know that because I flew all the others.
In August of 1964, the legendary F-8 Crusader was launched into the sky. This deadly aircraft is so feared by all North Vietnamese pilots that it is nicknamed MiG Master. The Crusader, however, is left as
the last of the gunfighters
when missiles replace cannons.
My fellow Americans,
It all started on August 5, 1964, when American planes from the USS Ticonderoga made history. This marked the official start of the Vietnam War for the United States. Just as in Korea, more than 10 years ago, the United States Navy was the pioneer in launching a large-scale offensive. The Navy was prepared to launch its attack well before Washington was prepared to make that pivotal choice, unhindered by the political and logistical hurdles experienced when operating from foreign airfields. Aircraft types A-4 Skyhawks, A-1 Sky Raiders, and A-6 Intruders were responsible for the majority of the assault missions. The leading military plan in the early years of the war was Operation Rolling Thunder. It included a gradual advance northward towards Hanoi via bombing the southern part of North Vietnam. As the bombs rolled northward, the idea was that the communists would capitulate, but the scenario failed to account for the North Vietnamese determination. Rolling Thunder was really a restricted technique despite the intimidating moniker. Important Chinese support lines were off limits, and pilots could only strike the targets who attacked them first. Still, casualties were high due to the aircraft assault. The United States bombing of Vietnam put the North Vietnamese Air Force into action. Among the North Vietnamese aircraft, the Soviet-built MiG-21 was held in the highest esteem throughout this fight. But the earlier MiG-17 was really Hanoi's most effective and prolific fighter. With its nimble flight and pinpoint accuracy, the MiG-17 was a deadly weapon against American planes. The Navy sent a fighter jet that had been the fleet's crown jewel since 1961 to protect the bombers from North Vietnamese MiGs. When it came to fighters with air superiority, the Crusader was among the best. Defeating MiGs was obviously the plane's intended purpose. Major General P. Drax Williams was commissioned into the Marine Corps in 1965. He flew a combat tour in Vietnam with a Marine Corps squadron. Williams left Da Nang to fly ground support operations for the Marines, which were among the most perilous missions he had ever flown, even though he has progressed through the ranks. The jet that returned him safely is something he will never forget.
This great old bird right here is the F-8 Crusader, once proudly known as last of the gunfighters. I flew it from 1965 to 1968 and did a tour in combat in Da Nang in 1967 to 68. It was powered by a great big Pratt & Whitney J57 P-20 Alpha, which won an award for being the first engine to sustain 10,000 pounds of thrust in basic engine. An afterburner, it would put out about 18,500 pounds of thrust. There are several interesting features about this aircraft. One of them is this unit horizontal tail. It didn't have elevators, and at the high supersonic speeds that the aircraft flew at, the whole tail moved up and down, which of course controlled the pitch. Another were these ventral fins right here. These were added on after several accidents. As the aircraft was being catapulted off a carrier, sometimes it tended to swap ends. These babies kept them straight. One of the very unusual aspects of this aircraft, unique in fact, is this wing. Most aircraft have flaps in order to slow down. This aircraft has no flaps. This wing raises up and the fuselage lowers. That allows the bird to slow down so the pilot can either land aboard a carrier or ashore. If due to some reason, battle damage, the wing doesn't come up, then he has to land in excess of 200 knots to avoid landing on the tail.
When hostilities in Vietnam broke out, the Crusader was prepared for battle. It saw heavy action as a fighter escort in the early going, defending bombers against MiG assaults. Thanks to E-2 Hawkeyes and super constellations, the fast Crusader could attack enemy fighters before they could even threaten the bombers, thanks to its vectoring capabilities. The Crusader became known as the MiG Master while serving in this capacity. Fighter pilots, vying for air superiority, fought fierce fights high above the North Vietnamese jungle highlands. The dogfights fought between highly trained American fighters and their non-Russian pilots, piloting Russian-built planes were reminiscent of those in the Korean War. This American pilot was looking under the nose of a MiG-17, a very frightening enemy. It was believed that the North Vietnamese pilots couldn't make the most of the jet since they weren't as proficient as the Russians. Instead of staying to battle, MiG-17 pilots would often use hit-and-run tactics and flee the scene. Pilots from North Vietnam held the Crusader in high esteem. When a MiG-17 pilot supposedly spotted a Crusader approaching from behind, he reportedly bailed from his aircraft, shot down MiG-21s over North Vietnam. Yeah, you won't see that often. On October 9, 1966, a pilot deployed from the USS Hancock was the first to defeat a MiG-21. He fired his Sidewinder after locking onto the fast Delta wing. Despite the fact that the F-4 Phantom was responsible for the majority of MiG kills in Vietnam, the Crusader had the best kill ratio with 19 MiG kills and only 3 air combat losses. Combat in the air was terrifying regardless of whether you were in a Crusader or a MiG.
Some people say that flying is hours and hours of boredom punctuated by stark moments of terror. I think we got our share over there. I'll never forget, of course, being shot at. I don't think anybody ever will. That's the first time I think you're ever convinced of your own mortality.
Even before the Vietnam War broke out, the Crusader had earned a reputation as a formidable gunfighter because to its 420mm cannon, the North Vietnamese MiGs were most effectively neutralized by the Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles. Only one of the Crusader's 19 MiG kills, the last one, was really accomplished by gunfire alone. A pilot flying a MiG-17 tries to dodge a Sidewinder that is closing in on them, but it's too late. Fighter pilots must have extensive training in the lethal art of aerial warfare if they are to be considered combat-ready when deployed. Miramar, California, often known as Fighter Town, USA, was the site of the Navy's fighter training school, which opened to pilots in This was the site of the first ever simulated engagement between the two top fighters in the Navy. Crusader and Phantom are fighting it out. The heated competition between the pilots of these two radically different planes highlighted this fake dogfight exercise at what is now called Top Gun School. Getting the adversary on the defensive was crucial, much like it was for the early dogfighters of World War I and the Spitfires and Me-1009s over British skies during World War II. Combat strategies do not alter despite advances in technology. Once Crusader and Phantom are out of one another's line of sight, the dogfight may commence. Locating the enemy requires the use of radar. A radar is a tool with both good and bad uses. Even if it warns the pilot of an enemy's existence, using it makes him the most visible target in the sky. Seeking out the Crusader, the Phantom pursues him. As part of its defensive maneuver, the Crusader executes a sharp left turn, causing the two aircraft to collide directly. All future interactions will take place visually. The dogfight is classic. During the 1960s, the Crusader and the Phantom were among the world's most formidable fighters for air supremacy. As expected, the animosity between the two was fierce. The Crusader pilots saw themselves unfettered by the Phantom's multi-mission function and viewed themselves as genuine fighter jocks. Phantom pilots made light of the Crusader's antiquated weaponry in a similar vein. It was a sibling rivalry, nevertheless, as are all military conflicts. They had a healthy rivalry, yet they ended up siding together when things got rough. Crusader pilots still insist their plane is unrivaled today. Robert Smith, a rear admiral, piloted the Crusader.
Cleaned up and in a fighter role, it is the best airplane there is to fly. It is more fun than anything you can imagine. It's the hot rod, the sports car of aviation. I've never met a person who's flown it in aerial combat, dissimilar tactics or dogfighting in the old days, who didn't really enjoy it. Now, to land it and bring it aboard a boat, now that's a different question.
One of my most vivid memories is, of course, bringing the airplane aboard ship. It was hard to bring aboard ship, always accelerating or decelerating, and if you didn't fly the airplane, it was going to fly you. And then once you got aboard, if you got a perfect three-wire, which is the best pass you can make, on a small carrier, that was about 12 feet, hook to ramp clearance. And then the flight deck personnel were always trying to taxi you off the edge of the carrier, it seemed, because the nose gear is about 6 or 7 feet behind the pilot. So the flight deck crew would bring you right up to the edge of the carrier, the nose wheel, the pilot would be over the water. And you'd see nothing but water running by underneath. And you had to have an awful lot of faith in those young men.
Fighter planes need exceptional maneuverability to succeed in the role. However, removing stability is the natural method to make an airplane more nimble. During the frenetic game of aerial battle, instability is a pilot's ally. However, after landing, it turns into his nemesis. Many have compared the Crusader to its illustrious forebear, the F-4U Corsair, because to its lightning-fast speed and exceptional skill as a Navy fighter. The chance-fought F-4U was, like the Crusader, a lightning-fast fighter for its time in the Navy. Landings were brutal, nevertheless, just as they had been on the Crusader. It was so merciless that it was derogatorily called the Ensign Eliminator. The Navy had strong feelings against aircraft that were cumbersome to board ships for reasons that should be readily apparent. With its unusual design and inverted gull wings, this fighter had been instrumental in neutralizing the Japanese Air Force for 3 years. However, it solely used land bases at this time. Subsequently, an event occurred. The iconic kamikaze strikes were launched by a Japanese military seeking to regain control of the Pacific. Even the Corsair couldn't keep up with these suicide-bent pilots as they dove headfirst into American ships. The Corsair was put into squadron duty on U.S. carriers. As the kamikaze attacks grew more persistent, it served with honor until the war's end. The United States held a monopoly on jet-powered aircraft by the early 1950s. The military, due to their high takeoff and landing speeds, jets were considered less trustworthy on carrier missions than tried-and-true piston aircraft by the Navy in the late 1940s. But pure jet fighters' growing acceptance came at the perfect moment. Jet propulsion was established during the Korean War by the success of carrier-borne aircraft such as the Grumman Panther and the Douglas Banshee. In the early days of jet aircraft, Douglas, Grumman, and North American were more successful than the Chance Vought Company. The XFU Pirate was their initial dive into jet design. However, it was a prototype that never flew. At least on paper, Vaught's subsequent undertaking appeared to be more promising. The first naval fighter to be equipped with afterburners and swept wings was the F-7U Cutlass. The Cutlass had a lot of issues, even if it had potential. It was despised by Navy pilots because to its high accident rate and its poor climb rate, which earned it the moniker Gutless. Vought was losing favor with the Navy after 2 unsuccessful fighter programs. In 1952, the service announced plans for a new Mach 1 fighter, giving Vought one more opportunity to turn out a successful program. Despite facing overwhelming odds, the Vought squad moved at a breakneck pace. The Crusader first flew out of Edwards Air Force Base on June of 19. John Conrad, the pilot, performed the unimaginable on the first flight. A supersonic speed was his velocity. Spinning back into the air after a familiarization flight is the most risky component of any flight test program. In the span of a few seconds, the pilot conducting the spin test will descend more than 30,000 feet. As he tests the responsiveness of an aircraft whose stability he doubts, he must endure the physically painful and mentally confusing impacts of extremely high G-forces. John Conrad was put through his paces by Vought spin testing, and the Crusader was always there for him. There was no such thing as a trainer during the early Crusader training. Actually, the introduction of a trainer would not occur until 1962. It was the opinion of many early Crusader pilots that this trainer was an unnecessary afterthought. Pilot John Conrad provides an explanation.
I must add that the Navy at that time in life did not believe in building two-place tactical trainers. The Air Force did. I feel that the Navy might have saved several of the losses of airplanes by neophyte pilots had they been trained in the two-place airplane.
Despite its eventual renown, the two-seat Crusader saw little action during its time as a trainer for aspiring fighter pilots in the United States Navy. Therefore, pilots had to fly the Crusader solo for the first time when it joined the Navy. In April of 1956, the Crusader underwent her initial carrier certification aboard the USS Forrestal. Without a hitch, Captain Duke Windsor executed 12 landings and 12 catapult shots. The Crusader started its career in the Navy after passing the most rigorous examination of any prospective military aircraft. As part of Allied drills in the Mediterranean, Canberra bombers from Britain simulated attacks on U.S. ships. Admiral Cat Brown of the 6th Fleet was not pleased by the impunity with which the aerial Canberras perpetrated these assaults. Brown took advantage of the fleet's initial Crusader arrival to show the British how to fight in naval air warfare. The pilots of Canberra's bombers were taken aback when they witnessed the new American plane performing vertical passes. The burgeoning star of the Navy's aviation program, excelled more than just the British. The record for fastest aircraft in the world, Mach 1.25, has been held by the F-100 Super Sabre since 1955. The United States took great pleasure in this sleek fighter bomber, which was the fastest jet in the world. But once the Crusader arrived, the F-100's record-breaking streak came to an end. Duke Windsor broke the F-100 record in late August 1956 by bringing the Crusader up to Mach 1.5. A young Marine pilot by the name of John Glenn would try to fly coast to coast for the record a year later.
We called it Project Bullet because if it came off the way we wanted it to come off, which did work out, I would average more speed from coast to coast than the muzzle velocity of a .45 caliber bullet.
Another result of Project Bullet was to ratchet up the competition between the Air Force and the Navy.
The Air Force had held the record, and we wanted to break the record, and we did. In fact, we asked the Air Force if they would loan us some of their jet tankers for this, and they refused. The plane that we actually used for this was a photographic version, which happened to have a little more fuel and also had cameras that would take side pictures as well as vertical pictures. And so we loaded all the cameras up and started them running at a regular speed, taking off out of Los Alamitos. And I think we did the first continual strip picture, clear cross country from West Coast to East Coast.
Chance Vaught had loftier goals than the Crusader, who was busy shattering all kinds of records. They envisioned a fighter jet in 1956 that would dominate the air supremacy race. The Super Crusader is a moniker for this particular F-8U-3. Despite sharing the F-8 name with its smaller sibling, the Super Crusader was a very different fighter with a far more aggressive appearance. It was widely believed in 1957 that the gunfighter age was coming to a close. Super Crusader's sole weaponry was missiles out of concern that the Crusader was heading for rapid obsolescence. The installation of huge ventral fins, which helped maintain the plane's stability at transonic speeds, was another distinguishing feature. The Super Crusader, similar to the Crusader, had raised wings for improved handling at low speeds. However, it became significantly bigger with an extra 5 feet of wingspan and 4 feet of fuselage. A massive Pratt & Whitney J75 engine, along with the bigger airframe, was intended to take this fighter interceptor above Mach 3. In June of 1958, test pilot John Conrad took to the skies for the first time in the Super Crusader. By the end of the summer, it had accelerated to a blistering Mach 2.6, and it was still the sole aircraft capable of competing with the formidable F-4 Phantom in the year's last series of test flights. There was no contest when it came to performance and air-to-air combat, sometimes known as dogfighting. A flying U-3 F-8 would devour it whole. It outpaced the F-4 in terms of speed and agility, both of which have since been improved. The Navy chose the twin-engine, two-seater Phantom in December 1958 over the Super Crusader, despite the latter's outstanding performance. The Navy's decision resulted in the cancellation of the F-8U-3 program and the transfer of all 5 aircraft to NASA for use in high-speed, high-altitude research. As the Super Crusader program was being canceled, the regular Crusader was being upgraded. The ejection mechanism that had been manufactured by Vaught was substituted with the well-respected Martin Baker seats, which were manufactured in Britain. Carrier flight operations are extremely risky. Hence, the seat needs to be able to safely eject the pilot at low speeds, underwater, and low altitudes. The majority of carrier accidents, as expected, happen during the arrival of the plane.
You have the pilot inside.
Crushing landings are a continuous reality for naval planes. Hence, sturdy landing gear is essential. After a troubling string of landing gear failures on the Crusader, engineers from Vought tried to fortify the gear by conducting further drop tests. The Navy's hunger for ever-increasing speeds was ravenous in the late 1950s and early 1960s. With her enormous Pratt & Whitney engines modernized, the Crusader maintained her lead in the early 1960s, a volatile decade. Anxieties over the Cold War caused a meteoric rise in military technology from 1953 to 1963. Jet propulsion was a new concept in the early 1950s, but within a decade, humans were already exploring the boundaries of flight at transonic speeds and talking of sending humans to the moon. The Crusader had to adapt because it was a design from the early 1950s. For the purpose of updating their electronics, radar, and armament systems, the majority of the original Crusaders were returned to Vought. The end product is the F-8D. With this upgraded Crusader, we could stay ahead of even the most advanced Soviet aircraft. But the Crusader wouldn't be ordered to attack Soviet MiGs first. Cuba was found to have Russian missile sites in October 1962. The globe teetered on the edge of conflict for 10 arduous days. A new approach was required of the United States after the downing of a U-2 espionage plane over Cuba in order to avoid Cuban radar. Photo coverage of the island had to be shot from nearly above tree line. In this same spot, the photographic Crusader faced its very first formidable obstacle. Operation Blue Moon was the code name for a string of low-level reconnaissance operations over Cuba that one photo Crusader squadron from the Navy and one from the Marines embarked on. At the conclusion of the war, 60,000 photographs had been shot, and President Kennedy personally honored both squadrons. The United States and the Soviet Union were always locked in a game of ping-pong throughout the Cold War. American carrier groups were often overflown by Soviet bombers. The Tu-95 Bear. The Bear was not to be underestimated, as it was armed with standoff anti-ship missiles. Crusaders were dispatched to meet oncoming bears in the sky. Pilot Hal Loney of the Crusaders remembers a similar incident.
They had a bear and a bison en route to fly over the ship. Anyway, we get out there and we fly a wing on the bear and the bison. I tell you, that's an eerie feeling. When a gun is tracking you everywhere you go, just like that, looking in there. At the same time, these guys are standing in the windows with a Pepsi-Cola bottle.
Soviet aircraft and tanks were intended to be pursued by the Crusader. Specifically, it was developed to fight Soviet MiGs at close quarters. The fighter jet, which served in the United States Navy, was a symbol of the country's will to counter what it saw as Stalin's and Khrushchev's expansionist policies. The Russians would not be its first test, though. The North Vietnamese government had grown increasingly committed to the idea of forming a united nation by 1959. This area had seen its fair share of conflict. Ho Chi Minh, whose real name was Nguyen Tat Thanh, asserted Vietnam's independence in 1945. Despite starting with just 34 volunteers, Ho Chi Minh amassed an army big enough to expel the French from the area. Ho Chi Minh was deposed following the 1954 triumph at Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh and Le Duan, the military strategist, started to look south. The North Vietnamese supplied the communist insurgency, fighting the Saigon administration with supplies via a web of waterways, routes, and bridges. The North Vietnamese were fully devoted to the southern struggle from the start of the conflict that would later be called the Vietnam struggle. The United States administration, on the other hand, opted to approach the conflict very cautiously. The plan's objective was to appease the North Vietnamese army without doing anything to provoke the Soviets. This restricted strategy was annoying and risky for pilots fighting the North Vietnamese.
Well, you're flying along and you can see a missile site down there, or a SAM missile sitting on a launcher, or a AAA, whatever, and you couldn't shoot at it because it's off limits unless it shot you or your wingman down, then you could go shoot at it. Well, or you fly down the same road, the same altitude 5 days in a row, and you knew sooner or later that, they're going to figure out that, hey, Louis, here he comes again, let's shoot him. And those were frustrating times.
The North Vietnamese enlisted their whole people in the Vietnam War when the United States became involved. Against the Americans, every able-bodied North Vietnamese civilian took part in the defense. Roughly 85% of all American aircraft losses in the North were caused by anti-aircraft artillery. American jets swooped into the tangled web of anti-aircraft fire that obscured the sky as they flew over the dangerous terrain of North Vietnam. Things were further complicated by the existence of surface-to-air missiles, AMS, manufactured by the Soviet Union, which zeroed in on the tremendous radar signals given out by the advanced American aircraft. The Crusaders were modified with a hard point on the port wing so the pilot could fire Zuni rockets in an effort to deafen the North Vietnamese artillery. Suppressing anti-aircraft gunners and SAM sites is a common task for the air-to-ground weapon known as Zuni rockets. A large number of Crusader pilots considered themselves fighter jocks and despised the notion of ground suppression with their thoroughbred aircraft. Its intended purpose was to engage MiGs in combat. Unfortunately, due to the reality of the Vietnam War, many of these pilots would rather dive headfirst into North Vietnamese gunners than engage in dogfights with MiGs. Marine pilots had to fly into artillery and ground fire, even though it wasn't the mission that the Navy Crusader pilots wanted. Crusader squadrons did not always sail from carrier decks. Near the year's end of 1965, Da Nang had become the home of the majority of Marine units. Ground support, flak suppression, and combat escort were the responsibilities of the Marine Crusader pilots. Major General Williams' first tour with the Marines was flown here.
235, the Death Angels. I joined them in Da Nang in summer of 1967, and within a week we were flying combat escort missions for the bombers up north. We would take off loaded with guns and sidewinders and fly fighter escorts for the A-6s going up to bomb North Vietnam. Pretty exciting for a young kid on his first combat tour.
The ground war that the United States soldiers were engaged in was becoming more and more treacherous. Besieged Army and Marine platoons were frequently caught completely off guard by the North Vietnamese ambush method of combat. Air support was crucial for ground forces that were already under assault. The precise position of the adversary might be sent to the aircraft by the forward air controller, by radio or a radar control beacon. The Crusader was a deadly expert at this task, even though the Intruders and Skyhawks were the principal ground support planes for the Marines. The Zuni rocket was an efficient weapon, despite its simplicity. The Crusader pilot screens down toward the ground soldier's designated target, and then just shoots. As part of their ground support duty, the enemy was targeted with Zuni rockets armed with phosphorus warheads. The approaching dive bombers could plainly see their target in the dark smoke that rose from the crash site. There is no easy way to tell how effective close air support was throughout the Vietnam War. Only the news of a reprieve for their ground forces could a pilot hope for when rockets and bombs vanished into the dense forest canopy.
The best missions were obviously the ones we flew in support of our ground troops. That was the most satisfaction when the guy on the ground would tell you, "Great job, you just saved a bunch of my Marines' lives."
The mission is never over for Navy aviators as long as the plane is back on the ship. A common adage among pilots is that flying is the second most exhilarating thing a man can do.
There are many medical studies done in Vietnam during the war where pilots, over a period of years, were hooked up with heart monitors by the flight surgeons in the squadrons. And the results were the same every single time. The heart rate of the pilots coming back aboard those carriers at night was always higher than it was when they were in combat over North Vietnam.
Approaching the ground, the Crusaders' engagement declined gradually for the length of the Vietnam War. It wasn't until 1967 that the F-4 Phantom surpassed the Crusader in combat flying hours. Although the Crusader, like the great World War II Navy fighters, was a gunfighter, its role had been made obsolete by air-to-air missiles and beyond visual range radar by the late 1960s. Its long-standing companion, the Phantom, eventually superseded it due to the Navy's increasing distaste for single-engine planes and an old airframe. French and Philippine naval forces welcomed many former Crusaders. As a research and photographic tool, NASA deemed the nimble gunfighter invaluable. The Crusader's fighting career, like that of the illustrious World War II Corsair, is only a celebrated part of Vaught's past. The last of the gunfighters gets ready to take off on their last trip in June of. In 1976, the Navy decommissioned the last of the small Essex-class carriers, including the Crusader, marking the end of its fighter role in the Navy. This joint retirement was fitting because of the long history of the airplane and the ship. Long into the 1980s, the Crusader served as a photo op until the F-18 Hornet took its place. When it comes to contemporary fighter planes, the F-8 Crusader is really alone. The Defense Department has insisted for the last 30 years that all newly built planes be able to do everything from bombing missions to aerial combat. Since the Crusader and the beginning of World War I, multi-mission aircraft have supplanted the once proud line of pure fighters. One more chapter in the annals of naval aviation is being closed when the final gunfighter takes off from Andrews Air Force Base